What you are about to hear defies everything you believe you know about the sacred figure of Jesus. The image that was sold to you, that of a gentle, obedient child filled with unconditional love since birth, is a later construction, designed to hide a reality much cruder and more terrifying that early Christians knew well. The forbidden texts, those we have been opening together on this channel, show us that divinity, when incarnated in an immature human body, does not bring peace immediately, but chaos. If the previous episodes, where we saw how a child's game ended in corpses withered or struck down on the ground of Nazareth, seemed disturbing to you, prepare yourself. Because today, the archive we open is not about an individual accident. Today we will narrate the exact moment when the child Jesus declared war on his own people. The day when an entire multitude learned, in the most brutal way possible, the price of threatening the Holy Family. Let's go back to that critical moment. We are inside Joseph's small adobe house. The air inside is heavy, almost unbreathable, charged with the smell of the carpenter's fear and the cold indifference of the child who has just warned him that he is not his owner. But the real terror is not inside, but outside. On the other side of the thin wooden door, the sound is deafening. It is not just shouts, it is the roar of a multi-headed beast. The mob, composed of neighbors who have seen 2 of their children die in less than a week, has lost its patience. They no longer ask for explanations, they demand blood. We can imagine the rhythmic blows on the wood. Thump, thump, thump. Every blow makes the hinges vibrate, shaking dust from the ceiling. Joseph looks at the door, knowing it won't hold much longer. He hears the known voices of his neighbors, now distorted by rage, shouting insults, calling them cursed, swearing that they will drag the family out of the village or burn the house with them inside. The heat of the torches that some carry begins to be felt through the cracks. Joseph is paralyzed. He is a strong man, a manual laborer, but he knows he cannot fight 50 people. And he knows, with an even greater terror, that if the door gives way, what his adopted son will do to defend himself will be worse than any lynching. He is trapped between the sword of the mob and the wall of a divine power he does not comprehend. The apocryphal texts do not describe Jesus coming out with a sword of fire, nor shouting with a voice of thunder. His intervention is much more terrifying due to its simplicity. It is the act of someone who controls reality as one snuffs out a candle. While the blows on the door reach their peak and the wood begins to splinter, the child Jesus simply decides that the siege is over. He needs no rituals. He needs not raise his hands to the sky. He only needs a thought, an intention directed towards those who dare to threaten his earthly home. And then, it happens. It was not a cloud covering the sun. It was not a gradual eclipse. It was instantaneous robbery. In a fraction of a second, the light of the world was ripped from the eyes of every man, woman, and child who was part of that enraged mob. 50 pairs of eyes that a second before saw torches, the door, and the hateful faces of their companions, suddenly saw absolutely nothing. Total blackness descended upon them. A dense, physical, inescapable darkness. It was not like closing one's eyes. It was as if the very concept of light had been eliminated from their minds. The sound effect outside the house changed instantly. The roar of rage was cut short, replaced by a second of stunned silence, and then by the sound of pure panic. Imagine the scene. The men who were beating on the door dropped their clubs, bringing hands to their faces, rubbing their eyes desperately, believing that perhaps dust or smoke had entered them. But upon opening them, the blackness remained. The women began to scream, no longer in rage, but from primal terror, the terror of suddenly going blind. Chaos seized the street. The mob, which before was an organism united by hatred, dissolved into 50 terrified and helpless individuals. They began to stumble over each other. Those carrying torches dropped them, causing small fires and burns that increased the shouts of pain. People grasped at the air, looking for a wall, a known face, something to tell them where they were. They called out to each other in shouts, fathers looking for children who were next to them but who they could no longer see. They stumbled over stones in the road, fell to the ground and crawled, disoriented, not knowing in which direction their own house was, even if they were only a few meters away from it. The threat of lynching evaporated, not due to a change of heart, but because the attackers could no longer even find the door they wanted to break down. Inside the house, Joseph listened to how the fury turned into laments. The carpenter, still trembling, approached a small window and looked out. What he saw would mark him forever. He saw his neighbors, the strongest and proudest men of the village, reduced to frightened children, crawling on the ground, crying, shouting for help to a heaven that seemed to have turned its back on them. He saw how, little by little, guided by the shouts of the few who had stayed further back and had not been affected by the complete curse, the crowd began to disperse. It was a humiliating and slow retreat. A procession of blind people grasping at adobe walls, moving away from the carpenter's cursed house. When the last of them was gone, a new kind of silence fell over Nazareth. It was no longer the tense calm of previous days. It was the silence of absolute trauma. At that moment, the village understood something fundamental. They were not dealing with a problematic child. They were dealing with a force that could take away their basic senses if it felt threatened. Hatred turned into reverential terror. They knew they could never again attempt to attack that house physically. Brute force had failed in the most humiliating way possible. Joseph turned to look at Jesus. The child was still there, calm, as if nothing had happened. Joseph then understood the magnitude of the power he had under his roof. He had incapacitated half the village without getting up from his chair. And Joseph felt, perhaps for the first time, a fear deeper than any other, the fear of being in charge of God himself. The village's attempt to expel the Holy Family by force had ended in supernatural disaster. The streets of Nazareth were now full of people who would have to learn to live in darkness for having confronted the child. But fear does not stop people forever, it only makes them change strategy. If brute force did not work, perhaps cunning would. The elders of the village and Joseph himself arrived at a desperate conclusion. If the child could not be controlled physically, perhaps he could be tamed intellectually. They needed a teacher, someone with sufficient authority and wisdom to submit that rebellious mind to human laws. And they found a volunteer, an arrogant teacher named Zacchaeus, who believed himself capable of bending any child. What will happen when human wisdom tries to impose itself on divine wisdom? Subscribe and activate the bell. In the next episode of the Forbidden Archives, we will open the doors of the School of Nazareth to witness the greatest intellectual humiliation in history, the day a 5-year-old child destroyed his teacher with a single letter of the alphabet. I am the Archivist, and the lesson is just beginning.